Hey everybody, it's Rudy Basso, the co-owner of Don't Split the Podcast Network. I would like to encourage you, lovely listener, to head on over to our website and give a listen to my show that I host with my brother called Game O'Clock. It is a video game retrospective, introspective, other spectives, all about the kind of games that we love. And to be honest, we love just about every game out there. Game O'Clock released every Thursday. It's fun, it's short, and hey, you'll probably learn something about video games.
This is Tabletop Babble. I'm James Introcaso. This week on the show, I'm talking to an amazing game designer and podcaster named Jim McClure. If you're not familiar with Jim's work, he has an amazing Kickstarter right now for an RPG called Satanic Panic. What's it all about? Well, we are going to cover that in our interview. We also get into a lot of discussions about game mechanics and how the mechanics can support the feel of the game you're trying to play and what DMs and players can do to foster that feel. Let's get to my interview with Jim right now. Okay, everybody, I am here with the one and only Jim McClure, an amazing podcaster, an amazing game designer. Jim, welcome to Tabletop Babble, which I swear I did not steal the title from you.
It's close, but I asked my lawyers and they said no go on it. So I was like, can I send him a cease and desist anyway? And they're like, if you really want to. But I was like, no. I mean, of course, I'm here with the one and only James Introcaso, and I'm so excited to be here. I'm throwing that one right back at you.
I also talked to my lawyers, and that's how I knew it was fine to come up with the name. But no, it's seriously awesome to have you here. You are one of my favorite people in this industry. The amount of work you put out is so prolific. The amount of podcasts you put out, the amount of games. This man, I'm not talking about adventures for other systems. I'm not talking about modules, which he does plenty of tinkering too. But I'm talking about full, from the ground up, role-playing games designed by Jim McClure. And you're like a young dude, too. You just keep going for it. And I know you've got a million projects waiting in the wings to come out, too. So I'm really excited. We're going to talk today about games that have these meta layers of game within games. We're also going to talk about mechanical feedback loops. But the reason we're talking about that is because you have a Kickstarter for a game called Satanic Panic. Jim, for our audience who doesn't know, what is the amazingness that is Satanic Panic?
Okay, all right. You ready for this, James? Let me drop this on you. All right.
I'm ready.
Here's what we got. It's the late 70s, early 1980s, somewhere in that time period. And there's whispers going all around the world. There's this new quote unquote game that has been taking its hold. Ooh. And like a silent wildfire spreading from basement to basement, it is taking over the heartland of our country. And this game is called Tabletop. But the catch is, everything that they whisper is true. Tabletop is actually turning people into monsters. It's actually summoning demons, and you play government agents that go around and break up rings of tabletop players. And that is the short elevator pitch of what Satanic Panic is. It is a tabletop role-playing game about hunting down tabletop role players.
And that is awesome. And if people want to get a taste of this role-playing game, you have an actual play podcast going on right now on the One Shot Podcast Network, right?
I do. And as you said it as a compliment earlier, I see it as a sign of my own insanity. But yes, on top of designing all these games and doing like a interview talk show podcast, I decided, why not? Let's do a weekly AP on top of it to test play this thing. So yeah, I do a podcast called Satanic Panic over on the One Shot Podcast Network, where myself, Emily, Thomas, and Jared all sit around and play Satanic Satanic Panic. That is currently ongoing, although the last episode airs the last week of the Kickstarter. So anyone who wants to listen, get on that. It is not one of these campaigns that lives forever. It's 20 episodes in and out.
That's awesome. That's like the perfect amount too. I'm like overwhelmed by trying to jump into Critical Role at this point, because there's so many episodes and each one's like 3 hours long.
So long, yeah.
So it's great to have something compact like that. And so, Jim, this is obviously a game that is meta, right?
A little, maybe. If you squint and look at it just right.
Right. The Satanic Panic is what the time period in the 70s and 80s when people thought Dungeons and Dragons was turning you into Tom Hanks and Mazes and Monsters was going on, right? And you've created this really fun, awesome game that people who are into tabletop role-playing games will get. And I think even people, if this was their first tabletop role-playing game, they would still have a good time and the meta layers are still there. You've also created some great meta games, the Terrible RPG, right? Which people can check out on DriveThru. We'll link it over in the show notes on our website here. That's a great one too. You tear off pieces of your character sheet as the mechanic instead of rolling dice or that sort of thing. And there's even a mechanic for like a mistear in there, which is super, super fun. So, if people are cheating, you can call them out on that, and then they have to tear up more of their sheet. And then once your whole sheet's torn up, you're done. It's such a cool idea. You have often talked about the RPG Everyone is John, right? Mm-hmm. Which is a really, really fun one. So let's talk about getting meta in games.
Okay.
What is it about getting meta that you love?
So I guess let me give my philosophy on meta games and games that have, I'm going to say, meta mechanics to them. Because it's really interesting to me. It's fascinating, in fact. You, as someone that does tabletop advice, I'm sure you have done tons and tons of things about how to deal with meta behavior at the table.
Sure.
And, of course, for anyone that doesn't know the definition of what we're talking about, is essentially acting knowing you are as a player playing a game and acting with that head knowledge and not necessarily the knowledge of your character. And this is something that I have seen our hobby kind of, I don't want to say fight against, but try and learn and develop tools to get people out of this idea of acting in a meta way. Well, I got thinking about that. And I got thinking about it and thinking about it and thinking about it. And while I don't disagree with the concept of trying to get people out of the meta mentality, I go, if this is such an ingrained nature, why don't we design towards it? Why don't we design games and have design philosophies and design mechanics that we incorporate this meta knowledge into the game itself? And I hadn't really realized that I had done that much until you were being way too kind, listing off all my accolades there. And I was like, oh yeah, the Terrible RPG has meta mechanics, and Satanic Panic absolutely has meta mechanics. And then, oh yeah, Reflections, the game of Dueling Samurai, it's has a core focus on a really subtle, in my opinion, meta mechanic to it. Yeah, I was like, oh wow, this is a common theme of Jim, I suppose. But anyway, the long and short of it is, I think that instead of trying to avoid the concept and try and design around, how do we keep them in character? How do we keep them in focus? How do we as GMs try and keep them, in the character level, in that magic circle? Why don't we design games where we take into account the fact that players are not going to stay in that level? To me, that's really an interesting direction for RPG design. Yeah,
so you're embracing what a lot of people see as maybe a weakness, which I think is a great way to approach things. Say, how can we bring this in? How can we make this a strength of the game? Because this is clearly something players, at least some players, right, want to do. So how can we make that a strength of the game? So how do you make that a strength of the game? Like, let's talk about that with some of the games that you've designed. How do we as game masters, as game designers, let that become a strength at the table?
I think the number one thing, at least in my opinion, to do on it is, and I'll give everyone listening a warning. I say in my opinion a lot because as much as James likes me, I'm a very opinionated person, so I try and emphasize the fact of this is one man's opinion that talks very, very strongly and uses strong language. So I by no means am making this projection out to the world, but in my opinion, the number one thing to do if you're going to approach meta mechanics is you need to give an easy pathway for the players to go back and forth between being a player and being a character. You need to encourage that pathway and not set up any roadblocks in either direction for it. So to give an example, we were talking about the game The Terrible RPG that I designed, which is a wonderful, lighthearted, silly, nonsense fun. James, of course, you gave the wonderful introduction to it. It's a game where you write any 6 skills you want on a piece of paper. You rip up that piece of paper. If you make the tear that goes through a skill you want to use, you use that skill and you succeed at whatever you want to do. It's a really simple game that has a few really interesting hidden elements to it. One being this meta mechanic of when it comes time to use a skill, you're deciding to use the skill because of roleplay, but then the use of the skill is this odd meta mechanic because I go, which skill do I want to use because it's going to be easier for me to make that tear and I'm going to lose less paper. So what I've done is I've made a game where it's everything at the table in roleplay is silly fun. As soon as you start ripping that paper, it gets tense for everyone at the table. So I'm getting that payoff of back and forth between my silly intention that I want in a game, and I'm also allowing the player to go, I am acting in character. Oh wait, I have to make a decision here that encourages the tense behavior that I want from that part of the game. And then once the tear is done and I was successful, hopefully successful in it, now I'm back to my silly fun and I'm back into character. I have an easy pathway flow back and forth between the two. Another game that Jim McClure didn't design that actually does this really well and doesn't get enough credit for it is Dread, actually, to a lesser extent. For those that know it, it's a horror game based around you have a Jenga tower that you pull blocks from to do actions, and when the tower falls, bad things happen, you typically die. That, to a lesser degree, but has that same idea of which block you're pulling has nothing to do with your character, has nothing to do with roleplay. It is entirely a meta behavior of, I want to pull these blocks that are going to prolong this the longest period of time. And it has that wonderful back and forth of, I'm in character doing stuff, now wait, suddenly I'm Jim and I'm trying to keep a Jenga tower from falling, and it has that wonderful tension to it.
And it plays up that horror aspect, right?
So
it
well.
Makes everything a lot more tense. And one of the things I love about Dread is you can take control of your own death, right? If you choose to knock over the tower, you still die, but you get to decide how your character goes out, as opposed to knocking it over by accident and the game master deciding how your character goes out. And so I love that idea of a mechanic that boils your blood up, you know, if that's the purpose of the game, that helps you get into the game. You know, the game within the game, for lack of a better term. So that's a great way to do it. And Satanic Panic is almost this extra meta thing because it is about our hobby. Even the fluffy bits, if you will, I like to call it the spice instead of the fluff. You know, it gives it a little more bold flavor.
I like that, the spice.
Exactly. Hashtag spice for everybody out there.
We are going to break into the Spice Girls market right now. That is an untapped tabletop market right there. We're going to get it.
That's right. We're going to actually kickstart a whole cooking spice line that's RPG spices too. It'll be great. But yeah, this idea of getting meta with the story, how did you get the idea for Satanic Panic? And how do you balance that with people playing the game and taking the parts of the game you want to be taken seriously, or is it really meant to be all a very dark comedy? You know, how do you balance meta story elements, like naming your wizard medium rare with the rest of what's going on, with like actual Satan worship, let's say.
You opened up a can of worms with that question. Because there's about 6 different answers to what you said going 6 different directions. So I will try and not run on at the mouth for too long here. But to give you a 10,000 foot in the air view answer of the question, how do we handle this sort of meta narrative within a tabletop game is, for one, I think it's got to have the heavy emphasis on the tongue-in-cheek humor, and that is, ha ha ha, we're going to go kill tabletop players. Like, we're all sitting around at a table talking about how tabletop players are horrible monsters. Like, okay, we get it. It's a joke. It's funny. Hopefully it's funny. It's funny to me, at least. It's funny to me and my small circle of friends. Maybe the rest of the world will hate it. Who knows?
Think it's funny.
I find it funny. It has that tone to it, and it has to have that tone to it to be able to, deliver what the game needs to deliver. And that is a wonderful, nice, funny experience that, as you pull the layers off of it, gets darker and darker and darker and darker and darker, which of course is the direction it goes. And in my opinion, any good comedy has a super dark undertone to it. And in this case, Satanic Panic actually very much does the same. But that's on the story level. To me, that's, I think, the number one thing that it has to be accessible. People need to be able to come into this. This is, interestingly enough, as you said at the beginning, this is not Timmy's first role-playing game. A lot of people, when they go to design, myself included, I want to be able to design games that just about anyone can pick up and play. And while anyone could pick up and play this game, it very much plays off the language and the expectations that the majority of people that play tabletop have. To tie it back to the mechanical example, one of the core subtle foundations of the game is there is a D20 that sits in the middle of the table. And you never, ever, ever want to roll a D20. Never want to roll that D20. But throughout the game, actions make that 20 tick up higher and higher and higher, one number at a time. If it ever hits 20, the GM has full carte blanche to just go crazy and try and kill the party. But the party can reset it at any time by picking it up and re-rolling it, which there's risks that come along with that. So what I'm playing on is the concept of, when we play a lot of tabletop games, I'm going to say shy of the indie revolution that's happened over the last decade, what do? I shouldn't say most games. The biggest, most popular games that exist, our D&Ds, our Pathfinders, are D20-based systems. We pick up and roll a D20 to have fun. Well, we're going the other direction, because everything is against tabletop. Picking up a D20 and rolling it should be the most horrifying experience that you possibly have. And when you roll it, the lower that you roll it, the better for you. You will jump up excited when you roll a 1, and your face will sink if you roll a 20. And that's all part of the wonderful little structural meta humor to it, yes.
So I love this idea of start out with the comedy, right? And from there, that's when you can start to get more dark and more serious. And I think that's right. That's great. It's like, let's acknowledge what this thing is. Let's acknowledge how fun it is, how silly it is, whatever, depending on what you're playing. And then if you want to build a base from there, you can get darker, which is awesome, because this is so clearly a dark thing, right? Too, if you're playing Federal Agents, I'm assuming a fair amount of these tabletop players are like teenagers, right? So, you need some humor to cut adults fighting satanic teenagers. I think that's the only way that you sell that and make it work. And it just is really entertaining to listen to. I really think people should check it out. And I think people should play it. I think people will really get a kick out of it.
Just to illustrate the point that you just made there, James, I think most apt Twitter comment I have ever heard in my life was, at the time of recording this, it was just earlier this week, I released the initial cover art. It's actually not quite done yet, but the initial cover of Satanic Panic, which is a kid under a blanket holding like a D20 that's glowing, and there's like character sheets and little tokens all around them. And then standing up above him where he can't see is you see two government agents holding assault rifles, and they're like backlit and have dark faces and all that. And the Twitter comment I got, he goes, "So let me get this straight. The good guys are the backlit people in dark shadows holding heavy machine guns getting ready to kill a child, right?" And I'm like, yeah, you get it. You see what's going on here. And as you say, like that, hopefully for those who are interested in that kind of thing, should have a level of absurd comedy to it, where at the same time it has a super, super dark undertone, and there's even another layer beyond that the game gets into of really what the game is about is how much we demonize people that are different than us. And that's actually, as the game progresses with play, what I found is people start realizing like, this whole thing of, wait, if they are a upstanding citizen, if we were to ever harm them, we are in deep, deep trouble, and our whole agency could collapse because we accidentally killed a person. If they've rolled one D20, they're a horrible monster that lost all their constitutional rights, and we can kill them immediately because they're horrible monsters. But we don't see any physical change when they roll a D20, so are they that different, or are we just saying they're that different? And that's the bottom layer of like, ooh, how dark do we want to actually go in our wonderful little comedy game?
Sure. This has a layer of like playing for the other side, putting yourself in the shoes of maybe your parents, if your parents didn't let you play tabletop games. And you can extrapolate that a little bit to be like, this is how Democrats feel about Republicans and Republicans feel about Democrats. And, not everybody, obviously, but like, I think the fact that this is in there and that the people who are playing it will be, if this were a real world situation, would be the targets, is such an interesting idea. And it lets people experience a different point of view that maybe they've never experienced before, which I think is really, really cool. Did you have that in mind when you designed it, or were you like, this is just going to be a fun game that appeals to everybody that I want to make?
As all designs do, they kind of develop in stages. The initial idea was, hey, we're going to have this fun, silly game where we're just going to flip the script. Let's take the Satanic Panic and let's just assume everything it was true. It was actually going on, everything that they said. So what would be the logical response? Well, the government would take action to try and stop it. They would try and contain it, control, eliminate it, all of that. I go, okay, that seems pretty funny to me. I get to play, it's an over-the-top world where the government's trying to hide tabletop from people, and there's no possible way that people can manufacture a D20. They're only artifacts that come from the other side, as the case may be. I'm like, that's a fun concept. And then we did our first playtest session of it. And I'll never forget this. Drew, one of my good friends here, actually the guy who came up with the idea for that cover that I mentioned earlier, that was his idea for it. After our first play session, like the last hour of it, like he's getting like sad. And I'm like, as a GM, I'm like, what's going on here? And then like we get to the end, and I was like, all right, let's debrief about the game and all that. And I go, all right, Drew, what's going on with you? And he goes, I feel bad for killing all the kids. Like they're attacking us with like, table legs that they break off when we bust down with machine guns and are like doing nothing to us while we are horribly destroying them. And that was the moment where I was like, oh, there's my next layer to this game. This isn't just a light satire surface level thing. There are levels that we can explore below that. So that was the first thing after that initial playtest. I was like, okay, let's start digging deeper into some of the themes that are being established here.
So, you know how when people talk about a horror game, like you need to get the player buy-in that players are going to be scared and they're going to do stupid things the way somebody might in a horror movie, right? You need to get that player buy-in when you're going to play a horror game. And if you're going to play a superhero game, you need to get the player buy-in that people are going to act like superheroes. So what do you think the player buy-in is when you're playing something like the Terrible RPG, or if you're playing something like Satanic Panic? What do you think players need to do, and GMs, what's that contract need to be when you sit down to play that game? Or is it still more based on the tone and story than it is on the actual mechanics?
James, that is a really, really good question. I'll tell you my belief on it. And that is, I think there always has to be some level of buy-in from the people playing the game. If we're going to sit down and play Candyland, I have to be okay with a arbitrary resolution game that I have no control over, because that's what Candyland is. That's a bad example, but all right, let's say I'm going to sit down and play Axis and Allies. I need to have a buy-in that I'm going to play a heavily mentally draining strategy game that's going to last 8 hours. And that's no different from whether I'm going to play a video game, whether I'm going to play a tabletop game, whether I'm going to go out and play hopscotch. I need to have some buy-in to what I'm doing. So I don't think this is a unique issue to tabletop, but we need to address it as such. Hey, we are going to come to the table to have this experience. Are you into having a comedy experience? Are you into having a heavy emotional experience? Are you into having a satire on Dungeons and Dragons experience? If you just give me a yes, like, yeah, okay, that sounds cool, I think that's all the buy-in that we can really need and really ask for from players and GMs alike. From there, I'm a big, heavy proponent that then the system needs to then be able to do the lifting. The players have a buy-in. The GM has a buy-in if they're coming down to play this game, if they're going to back it on Kickstarter, if they're going to open up and spend the time to read the rules and learn how to play this game. There is some buy-in there. From there, what we really need to do is we need to give them a system, as a game designer speaking, we need to give them a system and mechanics that encourage and reward and give them, hopefully, a better experience than what they could have done on their own. Because guess what? We don't need rules to sit around and role play. We can absolutely do it without any mechanical structure whatsoever. So to me, we should have a mechanical structure that then rewards the type of play. So let's use a nice example. Let's go back to the Terrible RPG, because I guess I probably should be kickstarting that thing, right? If I'm going to keep marketing it like this, but it's just a good example. The Terrible RPG is designed for absurd, over-the-top fun. Okay, so how do we get people? All right, so the first thing is, do you buy it? Do you want to have just a crazy, quick 2-hour one-shot play session where we'll just have crazy, stupid fun with it? Sure. All right, that's all the buy-in that we need. I've got a one-page RPG here for you. It's called the Terrible RPG. It's free. You can go over to thirdact.pub, download it yourself. There's our cheap plug for the interview, and you can play the Terrible RPG. The system's really simple. You're going to write down any 6 skills that you want on the back of this character sheet. And we start off with the game as a pun in itself. It's a terrible RPG and you're going to rip paper up. Ha ha ha. I hate puns so much. One of my other friends actually named that and I was like, damn it, it's so good I can't not name it that now. But so, we start off with a pun. The text is written in a humorous way, and you write any 6 skills that you want. And it encourages you, hey, you can write down swordsmanship, or you can write down, boating, or whatever you want, or you can be absurd, and you can write things like the potato of truth, or summon Cthulhu, or whatever it is that you like. And then the rules of the game, when people start out, they go, okay, this is fun, and they get a couple tears in, and it's good and interesting and all that. But then they start realizing the rules of the game say, when you make a successful tear of any of your character sheet, you succeed. So whatever you're trying to do, you succeed at. So now you have these 6 hammers in your tool belt, and they work on everything. So the only thing you're deciding is, which absurd hammer do I want to pull out and hit? I need to break down this door. Well, I can summon Cthulhu. I can use the potato of truth for whatever that means. I can use MacGyvering if I want to be straightforward. Or I could use Jewish woman guilt, because that was one of the ones that was on there, and guilt the guard into opening the door. Oh my God. Now we're at a level of absurdity because everything that you do just works. And you have 6 hammers that you have to force to work in every single situation, and they always work. So that is to me a situation where the system is in, not in an overt way, but in a subtle way, it is giving people the experience they want and hopefully helping them along in that experience, because it's a game about the comedy of absurdity. That's what the game is designed to do. It doesn't tell you that, it just gives you that through the mechanics.
I love that. I think that's an amazing explanation for it. And it is true, right? Like, that is a fun game, because if you put Summon Cthulhu on your sheet and you tear off words successfully, then you can summon Cthulhu, right? And that makes that story fun, and that's how you get that buy-in. And I love that sort of like idea that it's dawning on the players, like, oh my gosh, we won't fail as long as we can tear things correctly, right?
Can I tell a quick quick story on that specifically, that Summon Cthulhu skill, that came from a con game that I played it, and someone put that on their character sheet. It was the last skill that they had. They hadn't touched it. No one knew that they had. That's part of the rules also, is no one else can know what skills that you have, so that way no one knows, the absurdity that's coming. And they were in like the final fight of the event, and they're like, okay, and I summoned Cthulhu, and it was just sort of jaw drops around the table, but then we realized he'd never picked, or anyone else, the unsummoned Cthulhu skill, which would have been really useful. And as we know, Cthulhu isn't going to play by anyone's rules. So the end of the game was him continually tearing and summoning Cthulhu further and further away so that it wouldn't eat them and destroy the world as they tried to finish their mission. And we ended up with just sort of a fade to black where presumably Cthulhu destroyed the world. But it was this wonderful absurdity of he only had one skill left, but he was still using it to defend himself by resummoning Cthulhu in different directions farther away from him. So, yes, that was a little, that's where that skill comes from.
Oh, that is awesome. That's great. Hey, everybody, just wanted to take a quick break to talk to you about today's sponsor, Audible.com. Audible is an audiobook company that is offering a free 30-day trial and a free audiobook of your choice just for listeners of Tabletop Babble. I recommend you check out Norse mythology, written and narrated by the one and only Neil Gaiman. Neil Gaiman is finally talking about his big influences, and he's retelling classic Norse stories. You are going to love it. He's got such sultry tones. Check out Norse mythology, narrated by Neil Gaiman, or any other free audiobook you choose by going to audibletrial.com/DSPN. That's audibletrial.com/DSPN. All right, let's get back to my interview with Jim. So, speaking of mechanics, you also wanted to talk to me about mechanical feedback loops, because that's a big part of Satanic Panic, and it's not a thing we hear about in these game design chats that often. What is a mechanical feedback loop?
Aha! So, this is a really interesting discussion because mechanical feedback loops are things that we see very often in board games, especially resource management board games, but not a lot in tabletop. So, a traditional tabletop mechanic. Let's just take D&D. No one's ever heard of it, but let's just go with D&D. You have a list of skills, and you want to do something. So you roll the D20 plus the modifier that gives you a result, and you either pass or fail. Of course, at the GM's discretion, you could do different levels, but that's your mechanic. But that mechanic that role, that action, doesn't tie into anything else, and it doesn't tie back into itself. If that mechanic were to tie back into itself, then you would have a feedback loop. And again, this is something that we see in board games, but we see very, very rarely. I actually can't come up with an example of a feedback loop that I know of from RPG world other than Satanic Panic. I would imagine there's one out there somewhere that is a true total feedback loop. But I really like feedback loops. I'm going to say a long feedback loop, one that doesn't happen instantly, but one that takes a little bit of time, because that time will encourage a type of play. So, Satanic Panic, the core mechanic of the game, is a feedback loop. And it is I call it my four-spoke feedback loop is my core mechanic. Because if we look at D&D, the core mechanic is roll a D20 plus modifier to beat target number. That is Dungeons and Dragons. Everything else is a modification of that, essentially.
Totally, yeah.
This I can't describe it as one thing. I describe it as four things because they're all very connected, and that is our north spoke of our compass. If you want to follow me along on this journey here, is you roll dice to defeat the things that are in front of you. Seems pretty simple, straightforward tabletop. The one big caveat to that is, in this game, within the confines of whatever equipment that you currently have, you typically can roll way more dice than you ever need to defeat an enemy. You are almost always the most powerful force that you're fighting. You're way stronger than tabletoppers as an agent. You can just mow them down wholesale without problem. But what you have to do is you have to control your own power. So from our north spoke, which is we roll dice to deal damage, or to defeat whatever's in front of us, we follow that. If we roll too high, we deal collateral damage. Now, We are agents. We are trying to act in secret. We don't want to expose what we're doing or else it will increase the panic. And we are there to eliminate tabletop and keep the world safe. The more panic, the more people are talking about it. It leads more curious people into tabletop. So we never want to cause collateral damage. That's our enemy. So that is our east spoke, is collateral damage. If we roll too high, we deal collateral damage. Then we follow collateral damage down to our south spoke. Collateral damage affects our team's budget, which is we have a budget system, which is what you use for our west spoke to requisition gear. And you use your gear to roll dice to deal damage to the things in front of you. So what we end up with is this long feedback loop of every time I pick up and roll the dice, I can choose essentially how many dice I want to roll. I want to roll, I have a weapon that does D8 damage. I can roll 1D8 or I can roll up to 8D8 if it's got an 8 capacity to it. I can choose however much I want to roll. The problem is anything I roll above a 12 is going to deal collateral damage. So if I pick up 3D8 thinking I'm pretty good and I get a super high roll and I roll 20 on 3D8, I still deal my 20 points of damage. I'm doing real good on that, but I just dealt 8 points of collateral damage. That's going to reduce my budget. At the end of the mission, we tally everything up, and if you're over or under what your goal is, because you're allowed some collateral damage, some is expected, if you're over or under that amount, your budget's either going to increase or decrease. So now what you're doing at every single moment is you are making the decision, do I care more about my personal safety right now, destroying the threats in front of me, or do I care about the long-term growth of my team? Because almost all of the power increases that you get in this game are from increased budget, allowing you to requisition more and better gear. So that is the feedback loop that happens on a mission level within Satanic Panic.
That's really interesting. And I can think of mechanics where it's like, oh yeah, you've got heat or obligation from other role-playing games, but I can't think of games where those danger sort of signifiers increase because you're doing good. In general, when you're doing things well, right, those things decrease. So that's really cool that there's this balance you have to play, and it means that you can't just blow up a house because there's a kid inside playing role-playing games, right? You have to be a little bit smarter about it because your collateral damage is there. Or you could make the choice to do so knowing that you're going to suffer collateral damage. Do I have that right?
You're exactly right. The situation that I present is, okay, you and your team, you're down in a basement, right? You just cleared out a group of tabletoppers, but you hear something scratching and clawing in the room next door. You don't know quite what it is. You see this red flash that comes underneath the door. You grip your gun a little bit tighter. You throw open the door, and there is a 9-foot-tall demon inside. You're in combat. You have a choice. How many bullets are you going to put in that thing? Well, now I got to think about it because, yeah, I could roll 8d8 and probably deal 30 or 40 points of damage, which is a whole lot of damage to us, and we could destroy this thing before it touches us. But are we going to entirely destroy our mission? Because if all 4 of us do that, we just dealt 80 points of collateral damage and we just destroyed our budget. And actually, one of the lose conditions of the game is if you totally tank your budget, your agency just gets disbanded. So you can lose the game without ever losing a single fight. Is a wonderful little end game condition. So that's the example that I use of now I have to choose how much of a threat is in front of me and how much force I want to apply to it.
Wow.
I think it's an interesting little. I was just gonna say, if I could gloat for a second, I've been designing games since I was 10 years old. I can say with all honesty, I am most proud of the design work that I've done with Satanic Panic. I rarely say this about my own stuff, but I actually think it's a pretty slick mechanic that delivers the experience that people want, or I should say that delivers the experience that the game sells.
Well, that's what I was just going to say, right? We talked about this idea of meta mechanics earlier and how dread works. And I think what you've pulled off is something really cool because my instinct, right, as a human being, if I was faced with a 9-foot-tall demon, would be to empty my entire clip into this demon. But then that could cause all sorts of problems for me as a person, right? Bullets would go through the closet and maybe hit the other side of the room. You know, maybe the demon's an illusion and something really terrible happens because of that. Or I just run out of bullets and now I can't be a monster hunter anymore because bullets are expensive, right? There's all kinds of things. And so, like, it has that interesting push and pull that you might have when faced with this suddenly you're faced with a 9-foot-tall demon, but as a trained government agent, you have all these other things that run through your mind, right? You're thinking about the budget and the collateral damage, and so you've created that dissonance by using mechanics, not by telling players, like, now remember, you're a government agent, so you should think about what you're going to do. Like, it's just automatic because they, as players, are going to be thinking about that.
To that point, I hold that is a necessity of game design to me. As a game designer, I look at it like this. If I am telling my players or telling my game master, you need to play the game like this, I am just throwing words on the paper and doing nothing. What I should be doing is designing a game with mechanics that will make people want to play it like this. Now, of course, you can always find some group of people somewhere that's going to just play it totally different with intention of destroying it, and that's fine. That's perfectly fine. But if you play the game as it's designed, the mechanics should encourage the play experience that you're trying to get at.
Yeah, I mean, that's huge. And I think those things are really hard to think about. And then even harder to create, to sit down and say, okay, I want to create this sort of struggle whenever somebody is faced with a 9-foot-tall demon. It's hard to think of. And then it's even harder to actually design a mechanic for, and then to go play test and publish and all that other stuff is a lot of work too. So congratulations to you for doing that. This mechanical feedback loop is awesome. Meta mechanics are awesome. Satanic Panic is awesome. Let's talk about the Kickstarter just for a little bit here. The Kickstarter is out right now, people. You want to go to Kickstarter, search for Satanic Panic, or go to our website because we'll have a link directly there.
By all means, go check out the Kickstarter. Of course, I would very, very much appreciate it. This is the second Kickstarter that I've done. The first one I did was for a game called Reflections, a game of dueling samurai that was, way more successful than I was honestly expecting. But this one is a bigger game with a lot of bigger challenges to it. You know, I'm doing my first full size 200-page hardcover. If we hit some of the early stretch goals, it'll be a full color, beautiful art being done for it that I'm so excited about. So yeah, there's a lot of risks, a lot of challenges on it. So I very much would appreciate the support. But by the same tokens, I'm a game designer. I'm here to give you a good experience. So if any of this stuff you like, if it sounds interesting to you, if the wonderful silly fun sounds interesting to you, if the dark underbelly of it, if the feedback loops, whatever you have, if it sounds fun, by all means, go check it out. I'll tell you, one of the great things is any backer at any level, you immediately get access to the playtest document, which is a pretty expansive document. It's like 40 pages long or something like that. So you can pick it up instantly after you back the Kickstarter and start playing yourself.
That's pretty freaking cool. People are able to pick up and play immediately, and you can check out everything else this Kickstarter has to offer. Jim makes amazing games. He's an amazing person. I know he doesn't like to brag about himself, but come on, guys. He's been making games since he was 10. And this is super fun. Like, anybody is going to be able to get down with this if they love tabletop role-playing games. And that is everybody listening to this, I assume. If you're not, and you are listening to this, but you don't love tabletop role-playing games, I'd love to hear why you're listening. Probably just because our voices are so nice.
It's got to either be that, or there's just someone that just hates everything about tabletop so much, and he just listens to everything he can to take notes on how terrible we are. So if you're out there listening to this, go buy the game too. I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, you'll need it for your research.
Yes, absolutely.
And this might be a game you would enjoy, since you get to kill tabletop players. So, Jim, before we go, is there anything else that we should mention about Satanic Panic?
I think we pretty much covered it, but can I tell you another funny story?
Absolutely.
Okay, so what I did actually research for this game, which isn't something Jim McClure normally does. He either does things in his wheelhouse like Samurai, or he just sort of like, this is Jim's take on it, so be it. But this one, I did research on it. And one of the things I did research on was there is a movie, you referenced it earlier, called Mazes and Monsters. And it was fascinating to me because I didn't know this when someone told me. They're like, "Oh, you're doing Mazes and Monsters the game." I was like, I'm doing Jack Chick the role-playing game, let's be honest. They said you need to watch Mazes and Monsters. So I go, "Okay, fine." So it's late one night, it's like 11 o'clock, which is late for me because I'm an old man. And I turn on Mazes and Monsters. I go, "Okay, I'm going to watch this." And the first thing that jumps out at me is I was like, that's Tom Hanks in what is like a B-level college film, seemingly. I'm like, this is one of his like very, very first roles, and he is a really good actor. Like, I was like, he's blowing everyone else away, but I was like, oh, Tom Hanks is in this. Okay, all right, I'm on board. I had, I think, the best experience of anyone ever could watching Mazes and Monsters, and anyone that hasn't seen it, I'm going to tell you to watch it exactly the way I just watched it, which is, watch this movie because the first half of it is the biggest endorsement for tabletop I've ever seen in my life. Because I'm watching this movie and I'm like, it's these people that go to college and they're into tabletop, and Tom Hanks, who's our main character, he meets his love interest via tabletop, and the nerdy isolated kid, he finds a social group, and they have like a whole love montage that's based around tabletop, and I'm like, there's a horrific turn coming at some point, because like this is the most ringing endorsement. It's like, do tabletop, you will find a girlfriend, you will have friends, you will be able to socialize, it will make you a better person, is what the entire first half of that movie is doing. And then bam, I fell asleep and I never saw the second half of it. And I was like, this is how I choose to remember Mazes and Monsters, a tale of why tabletop is so awesome.
Yeah, it's true. And you can watch it on YouTube. The full thing is up there. Just turn it off in the middle.
Absolutely. Highly recommend it.
I recommend doing the same thing with like Old Yeller and some other classic sad ending movies. So that is really funny. That
was my experience with Mazes and Monsters, yes.
Yeah, I've never watched it that way. I've only ever seen it once because it's a kind of a terrible movie.
It's so bad.
Tom Hanks he's great in it, because he's a good actor. But yeah, it's not well shot. It's on a budget. But oh man, I wish that I had just watched it like a big commercial for tabletop. That's amazing. Well, Jim, thank you so much for coming on today. Where can people find you on the internet? You've got a lot of places where people can find you. So let's hit those up right now.
All right. So the rundown, if you would like to directly talk with me, the best thing to do is I am very active on Twitter. I am at GM Jim McClure. That's GMJIMMCCLURE. And that's if you want to interact with me sort of directly. If you would like to listen to more of my voice, you can go on over to the One Shot Podcast Network, where we have the actual play of Satanic Panic, where you can hear the game being played, or you can go over and listen to Talking Tabletop, which is the interview podcast that I do, which has such notable special co-hosts as James Introcaso, who's been on it. So you can go listen to us reverse the mics and me make him talk. And then on top of that, of course, I co-own a publishing company called Third Act Publishing, which you can go on over to thirdact.pub and check out all of the amazing things I'm doing there. You can download yourself the Terrible RPG for free. You can buy yourself a copy of Reflections, the Game of Dueling Samurai, if you want. And then in a little while, of course, we're going to have Satanic Panic on there. But for Satanic Panic, what you need to do is go on over to Kickstarter/Satanic Panic and lend your support. I would really appreciate it.
Yes, absolutely. Go do that, because I would like to have the hardcover book that you talked about. So everybody should go do that so I can get my copy of it, and then you all can get your copy of it. And Jim can keep making amazing games and knows that the community loves him. So Jim, thank you so much for joining me today, and thank you for letting me steal the name of your podcast from my podcast.
The lawsuit's coming, but thanks, James. Thanks for having me on.
You know, Tabletop Babble is still a very new podcast, and we need help growing, and you can help us. You can do that by going to iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts and leaving us a great review. In fact, I read one new 5-star review verbatim each episode and credit the person who left it. You can make me say anything you want. Right now, DM Mitch of the Dungeon Masters Block podcast has made me say the craziest thing. Can you beat him? Let's find out. Today's review comes from Noverton. It is entitled, Enjoying the Conversations and Information. Noverton says, I have been a player since AD&D, but skipped much of the 4th edition era due to kids, work, etc. And I love the fantastic conversations and information for players and DMs like me who are dusting off the DM screens, finding all the sets of dice the cats have run off with, and explaining to the kids it's a game with no board or screen, but it's still fun. Thank you for your time and effort. Keep them coming. Thank you so much for your review, Noverton. It's great to hear that we are reaching out to inspire players who have been playing the game for a while now. So I really appreciate your ears. I really appreciate the review. People, I'm running out of them, so go leave us another review. Help others find us. And if you want to support the show in another way that will cost you nothing extra but send a few pennies on the dollar our way, go to our website, don'tsplitthepodcastnetwork.com, and click on the links for Amazon and Drive-Thru RPG before you shop on those sites. It costs you nothing extra, but it does throw a small percentage of your sales our way. Would really, really appreciate that, especially since, you know, people are going to be buying gifts for loved ones, and RPGs are awesome. I know you're out there buying them, so before you go buy one of Jim's RPGs, go to don'tsplitthepodcastnetwork.com and then click on the banner for Drive-Thru RPG and then buy it that way. That way Jim and this show both win. All right, people, you can find links to everything I do at worldbuilderblog.me, and you can follow me on Twitter at James Introcaso. Hey, check out some of the other shows on the network, too. We've got a lot of really great ones. I personally love Game O'Clock. It's with Rudy and Alex Basso, friends of this show, talking about video games. And I am on the latest set of episodes. We're talking about those old school LucasArts adventure games. It's a really, really unique format for video game podcasts. I think you're really going to like it. Each month they tackle a different genre of game and they dive deep. It is incredible. If you love video games, check out Game O'Clock. Okay, people, this podcast is a member of the Don't Split the Podcast Network, thanks to Rudy Basso for starting it with me. The theme music, which you're listening to right now, was provided by Battle Bards. Remember, RPGs are like sex. As long as everyone's having fun, you're doing it right.